When Arlene Fraser turned up missing, it just seemed natural that the person who would spearhead the search for her would be her own husband, Nat Fraser. And he did, at least to the best of his abilities. He appeared on TV and made an offering of $18,000 reward for any information on his wife's whereabouts. I quote, "Come back, the children are missing you terribly," unquote, he pleaded. He was a fruit and vegetable wholesaler, so he had either won a lottery, was quite comfortable and making so much profit in his business, or knew perhaps that the reward money could never be gotten because Arlene would never be found. On the morning of April 28, 1998, Arlene Fraser went about her day like every other morning. She did the house chores and kissed her children goodbye as they walked down the street. She would then call her children's school to make inquiries about the coming excursion the school was organizing. What would later happen that afternoon would result in the greatest hunt of the century and eventually one of the biggest murder cases that Elgin and the whole of Scotland would witness. Arlene and Nat got married in 1987, and the events leading onto their marriage was one of a whirlwind romance, and that's how the story goes. You know those romance movies where a guy is known to be a bad guy, and then, though he has dated and treated many women badly prior to meeting the female antagonist, everything just falls into place and they fall in love. Yeah, that's the kind of romance. Things soon fell pretty bad once they were married, as it was one peppered with domestic violence. Arlene tried to leave the marriage several times, but Nat always claimed his way back into her life, and as at the day she disappeared, there was already a threat to her life. Nat had tried to strangle her to death 5 weeks earlier, but he got out on a bail easily after being charged with attempted murder. Arlene was done with the marriage for the last time and tried to file for a divorce, and as at the time they were no longer living together. Of all the people that confirmed that Arlene just couldn't go somewhere unknown, abandon her children, leave the washing machine running and unattended to, and most importantly, forget her medication for her Crohn's disease, which she had been diagnosed with, one particular trail stuck out for the investigators as to what must have led her disappearance: her solicitor. Loanne Lennon confirmed that on the day Arlene went missing, she was supposed to meet her to discuss filing for divorce. She was planning to settle with the custody of their 2 children and half the couple's almost $1 million. Nat obviously refused this. He couldn't care less about the children, but he wasn't giving her more than $40,000, and if she didn't accept it, he'd make sure she got nothing. 6 months after her disappearance, Grampian Police Detective Chief Inspector Peter Simpson said in a press release, I quote, "The only conclusion that's still left open to us, which I firmly believe has happened, is that something criminal has taken place here and that Arlene has been a victim of a crime. I'm of the opinion that she's dead. There's no indication that she's living somewhere else," unquote. Despite being on bail for assaulting her, Fraser was initially charged with attempted murder, but this charge was later reduced to assault. Police still believed his claim that he was out delivering fruit and vegetables, and at the exact time of Arlene's disappearance, he was making a phone call to a woman in Fochabers. It was a perfect alibi, but too flawless for some experienced detectives, who began to suspect that the threat of the divorce settlement and losing custody of his children was sufficient motivation for Fraser to commit murder. Another main flaw in Fraser's behavior that stirred up their suspicions was the new concern that he showed for the woman he'd been painting as a bad wife and mother. He would rush to the police station every few days to ask about news about the investigations going on. There were many evidences that led to the greatest big reveal of Nat Fraser's involvement in his wife's murder and the mistake he should never have made. First, the police discovered Fraser's farmer friend, Hector Dick, had bought a second-hand Ford Fiesta in weird circumstances. Dick said he'd been asked by Fraser to find a runabout for Arlene after the family's previous car was found torched outside their home weeks before. That car has never been traced, leading police to believe it was used in her disappearance. Also, 9 days following Arlene's disappearance, her wedding rings reappeared within the house. Her family discovered them hanging on a hook above the bathroom sink, and detectives suspected that Fraser had deliberately returned them to the house in an attempt to create the illusion that she had given up on their marriage. Unbeknownst to him, the police had recorded the house, and the evidence revealed that the rings had not been there previously. While all these raised police suspicions, Nat could prove he'd been at work on the day Arlene disappeared. Still, one of the most crucial pieces of evidence perhaps was Nat's own undoing of himself when he, in not many words, admitted to his involvement in her death. Following Nat's 18-month prison sentence for a reduced charge of assaulting Arlene, authorities closely monitored his activities. In July 2000, Nat's friend Glenn Lucas paid him a visit in jail. Surveillance footage capturing their interaction was later examined by professional lip reader Jessica Reese. She remarked, and I quote, "I had no prior knowledge of the case, but it was glaringly evident that they were discussing something deeply disturbing. How often do you hear someone casually mention, in ordinary conversation, 'Her arms are off, and I pulled her teeth out. They can't find her. It's impossible?' It sounded highly suspicious to me," unquote. Jessica reported that Nat confidently stated, "I'll get away with it. It's all right. There's no evidence. It's all down the plug hole." Nat also boasted to fellow inmates that he had committed the perfect murder. His primary concern revolved around his best friend, Hector Dick, potentially betraying him. Both Glenn and Hector were charged with conspiring to murder Arlene, but in a strategic move, prosecutors dropped the charges against Glenn. They offered Hector a deal. If he cooperated and shared his knowledge, his charges would be dismissed. On April 6, 2002, 4 years after her disappearance, Fraser, Dick, and Glenn Lucas were charged with conspiring to murder Arlene, actually murdering her, and attempting to obstruct the course of justice. During their trial, the Crown declared that Dick and Lucas, the latter of whom had passed away in 2006, were not facing prosecution for the murder. Dick was said to be a witness for the prosecution. In court, Nat continued to assert his innocence, while Hector took the witness stand and revealed that Nat had paid a hitman $27,000 to carry out Arlene's murder. While testifying, Dick admitted to burning and crushing the Ford Fiesta that the police had been seeking out of fear that it might be connected to Arlene's disappearance. He asserted that Fraser had confided in him about orchestrating his wife's murder and subsequently disposing of her remains by grinding them up and burying them. He vehemently denied any direct involvement in her disappearance. I quote, "When Arlene said she was leaving and starting a new life, he just couldn't accept it," unquote, Hector said. I quote, "Nat is the only person who knows where Arlene is," unquote. In January 2003, Nat was found guilty of murder and sentenced to 25 years in prison, but in May 2011, he won an appeal when his lawyers argued that in the absence of a body, physical evidence, or witnesses, Nat had been unfairly convicted. Arlene's family were shocked when, just a few days later, Nat was released. His freedom was short-lived, however, with prosecutors successfully applying for a retrial and Nat being taken back into custody a few months later. Nat Gordon Fraser was found guilty of his wife's murder for a second time in 2012 and is currently serving 17 years to life. While Arlene's family are hopeful they may one day recover her body, Alan Smith, a former detective superintendent with Grampian Police, doesn't believe the killer will ever do the right thing and reveal her whereabouts. I quote, "I think the real Nat Fraser is a very dark and cunning individual," unquote, Alan says. I quote, "The last piece of control he has is that secret that he'll probably take to his grave," unquote. Arlene's grieving family will never have a sense of closure until Twisted Fraser gives up his secrets. It's unlikely he ever will. He believed he'd come up with the perfect plan for murder and has refused to admit his guilt. Revealing where Arlene is would mean admitting to his family, his children, that he killed their mother in cold, premeditated blood.